Hello, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual event with Elias Rodriques and Diana Abu-Jaber to discuss All the Water I've Seen is Running. Elias Rodriques' work has been published in The Nation, Book Forum, N+1, and elsewhere. He lives in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and is an assistant professor of African American literature at Sarah Lawrence College. After parents asked her to recommend books about Arab American families, Diana Abu-Jaber wrote Silver World, a fantasy with an Arab American girl at its heart. Diana often writes about the intersection of food, family, and cultural identity. Her other books include her memoir, Life Without a Recipe, Birds of Paradise, Origin, Crescent, and Arabian Jazz. Her upcoming novel, Fencing with the King, will be published in 2022. Diana teaches at Portland State University and lives in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Throughout today's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order copies of All the Water I've Seen is Running by pressing the green button below. And that also takes you to our shop site, so you can order any of Diana's books there as well. And we appreciate each and every order, of course. We also appreciate the donations from viewers everywhere. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hi.
Hi.
Hello. All right. Well, I'm so happy to be here and discussing this wonderful new book. You can see. All the Water I've Seen is Running. I am thrilled because Elias and I have the same publisher and the same editor. And so I was really excited when they sent me his beautiful new debut novel. And I was hoping we could start with a reading from Elias, if you would maybe kick things off for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Diana, for hosting. I really appreciate it. Couldn't really figure out why my screen is washing me out, but I want to be really clear. This is not a filter. Not, trying to touch up my appearance. So I'll read briefly. And this is from the first chapter. Back then, we body surfed until salt water rushed into our sinuses and pushed liquid mucus out our noses. When we tired of trying to catch the tide, we waded out, stopping to dive under incoming waves. Above us, the rushing water sounded like wind heard from within a plane landing. We surfaced and continued out to where we could not touch. We treaded and bobbed in the tide and congregated on sandbars. When that exhausted us, we swam back to shore and baked in the sun until the day turned to a haze of half sleep. We lived for water, salt, fresh, and brackish. We waited out school days for the weekends and school years for the summers to return to it. We stood on our river's mud shores and cast lines, hoping to catch something big, only ever reeling in catfish. We wriggled our hands into their mouths, unhooked their slimy insides, and tossed them back into our brackish river. After sweat and spray coated our faces, we kicked off our flip-flops and swam in murky waters. When the sun stole our shade, we moved on to the next shore or pier or dock or dinghy. We were all waiting for life after high school, after our no-name town in North Florida, so we figured we'd wait by the water. On the best nights, we saw the glint of moonlight rippling on a current. I spent many evenings with the girl I loved in high school, Aubrey, trying to touch the moon's reflection, our hands plunging through cold waters as if digging in the sky. I like to stand in the glow and pretend we were characters in some fantasy book carrying out a ritual, my hair standing on end as the magic took hold. But I think it was just the feel of Aubrey's eyes on me, a black boy on the wrong side of skinny, who never thought anyone would want him, least of all her. The longest night we spent on the biggest river that runs through Palm Coast, the Intracoastal, was when I was 17 and Aubrey was 18. We made plans at lunch. She was waiting at our table and I hoped to rush through the free lunch line at school, but it was longer than normal. The growing number of middle-class kids in line, all of whose parents worked in real estate or landscaping, suggested something was changing. But I wouldn't learn what until the 2008 housing crash gave my county, the highest unemployment rate in the state that had the highest in the nation. By the time I retrieved my lukewarm burger and french fries and joined Aubrey, a dark-haired white girl standing to about 5'6", lunch was almost over. After we shot the breeze, I asked what her weekend plans were. She said she didn't have any. I said we didn't have a track meet tomorrow. She said we were going fishing that evening. Lost in daydreams about the night to come during my classes and at practice, the day passed by in a blur. On the school bus home, Des asked if I wanted to kick it. I said I was hanging with Aubrey. He extended his hand, dapped me up, didn't say anything else. When I got home, I told Mom I was spending the night at my friend Twig's house. An hour later, she dropped me off, and after she left, I drove Twig's car to Aubrey's house. In her neighborhood, every street name started with a B: Bird of Paradise Drive, Buffalo Bill Place, Brushwood Lane, so everyone called it the B section. The houses there were bigger and the lawns better kept than in my part of town, but Aubrey's driveway seemed poorly paved for the neighborhood. I knocked on her window and she came out. Her hair was up in a ponytail, and her teal Abercrombie shirt was just short enough that it exposed the sea bass tattoo on her waist. I tried not to stare, but I kept glancing at the curve her hip bone drew. "You could have rang," she said. "It's late." "My folks don't care," Aubrey said. She opened the garage. We hooked her dinghy up to a red truck as I tried to avoid looking at the Confederate flag bumper sticker that I assumed was her sister's. Then we got in the car and drove to Bing's Landing. As we pulled in, shadowy Spanish moss swayed from the branches overhead. We passed the one-room barbecue joint and the small grass square that made up the park. At the river's edge, silhouettes swung. I heard a hook splash into the Intracoastal. I was trying to distinguish the line from the night when Aubrey reversed the truck down the ramp and the dinghy into the water. We got out, detached the boat, held it still. "Get in," Aubrey said, barely more visible than the shadow people in the distance. "Where you going?" "To park. Can't bring it with us." "What if I float away?" "Hold on to the dock." As she walked away, she muttered, "All them book smarts and not a lick of common sense." I got in and grabbed its rough wood beams, which felt like they might splinter into my hand. The water bobbed beneath, and I worried I would fall. Moments later, a gray-blue hue to her skin, Aubrey returned with the spear, the bucket, and the lamps. "Can we turn the lights on?" I asked. "Gotta wait till they're in the water," she said. "I can't see anything." "Are you afraid of the dark?" Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you for reading that section too, Elias. That's one of my favorites. I have so many favorites, and that one was so evocative because of how you work in physical description and the sense of place, and you get into both the beauty and the grit of the place. And that's one of my favorite things about this book, how you move between spaces. Now, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, you have a great treat ahead of you. The book actually opens in New York City, and the protagonist, Daniel, is making a new life for himself in New York, but he's about to embark by returning to his earlier childhood home. And so we're going to spend most of this book in Palm Coast, Florida. And I was going to ask, I feel like most books basically have their own journey, that they start out as ideas, they might start from personal experience, perhaps from an idea, a received idea in the world, but the characters kind of grow as they will, and they take on their own shape and their own form. And you have to have a lot of bravery to write these things. You have to have faith in the story, and you have to believe that the characters will take on their own lives. I was wondering, would you share with us the story of your journey to this book? How did you come to write it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. Thank you. When I was, I don't know, maybe 24, maybe 25, a friend of mine from high school passed away. And it was someone who I had not been in contact with in a while, but she was basically my best friend for all of high school. And I was surprised by how sad I was, but I was also kind of naive and sort of unable to really deal with what I was feeling face on. And so as often happens with death or with major events like a pandemic or a war, I just thought that day, that night, about what it was that I wanted to do in the time that I had left. One of the unfortunate things about someone dying so young is it can really make everything feel quite scary. One of the many unfortunate things, and I was like, well, I don't know, if I could die in a crash tomorrow, maybe like I should try to do this writing thing I have said that I want to do, and so I sat down, and the first piece I wrote was actually a scene where Daniel is just returned home, and he's at this beach, and he's kind of a stranger here, and the beach is really not the beach that he recognizes, and he ends up sleeping with someone, another man on the boardwalk, which is a cruising scene is maybe a really strange way to start processing your grief, but
makes sense.
Yeah, it did make me feel much better, and so I kept at it. I had, was very bored of everything, as one sort of is when one's deeply sad. I was bored of TV. I was bored of people I was talking to, the things that I was doing. Like maybe the two things that sounded appealing were like getting on a long distance bus ride, and listening to music. And as I wrote, I kept on, and I began to feel better. And then I encountered a character named Desmond, who proved to be a huge problem for me, because the book is fairly restrained until Desmond appears.
Yeah.
And Desmond had this voice that I was very familiar with, that took up a lot of room, that told a lot of stories. It's very funny, lots of jokes. And at first I was like, what am I going to do? I've got this character who won't shut up, effectively.
Yeah. It's just so great.
And eventually I was like, well, why don't we just bear this out? I remembered someone saying something to the effect of that, all of your first drafts are going to be bad. Just write it all out, and then you'll polish. And I just sort of let Desmond and Daniel direct. And that was the book that became this,
Yeah, I can see that. And I think that tension is really kind of a trademark that I feel was here in your novel. That movement between spaces, like Desmond has his voice. Daniel's voice is different, and there's a narrative voice. There's some code switching that's going on, and Daniel, as a protagonist, he's in this what some might call liminal space, that in between place. His racial identity is in between. He's mixed. His sexual identity is, thrown into question. There are lots of juicy, tantalizing questions and movements in between that I feel mark through the whole book. That electricity that happens when you aren't sure about something. And I feel like your character really resists labels. Was that something you were doing deliberately, Elias? Were you really working on that, or was that something that kind of grew out of the writing process for you, the pushing against confinement or labeling?
I think to some degree it grew out of the writing process. I think it also maybe grew. Sorry, I answered that question way too quick. I definitely should have collected my thoughts. I don't know is the short answer.
Yeah.
I think the longer answer is maybe something like, Daniel was in some ways a kind of insistent voice, and he kept speaking to me. And I thought to myself, I was like, well, I want to be honest in this transcription. I don't want to let this character hide too much, and I just want to just sort of render what I'm hearing or what I'm imagining without judgment, and without thought. And that was a big part of it, I think, as well as, I think is some of it that has to do with queerness in particular, which often throws into confusion and question all of these sorts of relationships. I mean, I feel like this is maybe most clear whenever I talk to my friends' kids, who are, in ways that maybe don't make sense to some of us because we didn't grow up in a particular moment, but they will say perhaps, oh, I am of this identity, but I'm also currently dating this other person. And it's like, that's really interesting. And that was not a sentence you could say in 1984, a sentence you can say now, and it means something to you and your friends, but you could not have said that before, and So
Right.
some of that, and I think also a big part of it, I think, is about migration, and about the difficulty of translating words, terms, identities from one place into another. There's a degree to which Daniel's racial identity makes a good amount of sense. There's a sort of like understanding of what it means to be of both Black and Indian descent in Jamaica that doesn't really exist in America.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I think is a big part of why, to some degree, Daniel ends up resisting labels, is also about the ways that migration end up making labels slippery. The labels of the country that you arrive in don't always end up working for you because you were reared in a place that had a different set of labels in a different world.
Right. Which is so fascinating. It's got so much energy to it, and I think it's so important for people to see that kind of shift in the lens. That the identities that you grow up with may not be global. They may not be as innate or inborn as we want to believe, and that's that can make people feel profoundly uneasy. That things aren't necessarily so easily categorized. And another facet of this book where I feel like you're working with some of that is his identity as a runner. And one of my former student of mine, Mitchell Jackson, he just wrote a piece about running. It was about Ahmaud Arbery, basically about the idea that running failed him as a young Black man, and that running is something that has been sort of cosseted by white male privilege. And he asks in this article, who gets to run? Who deserves to run? Why do some people have this privilege? Why are some people given the safety of running and others are not allowed to move through space in a way that is safe? Was that something you were in any way thinking about, or was that a deliberate choice to go with running versus, something that would be more accessible to this character?
That's a good question. I've read that Mitchell Jackson piece. It's really good.
Isn't it good? Yeah.
It's really good. Yeah.
I'm proud of him.
Yeah. So it's a really great piece. Running, I could talk about running for like the next 7 hours. So please come back at some point, but running is track in particular, sprinting in particular, and running more generally it's just really interesting, I think. Running has a kind of mythology behind it. And indeed, I think, organizations like the IAAF or the International Olympic Committee tend to valorize running as the kind of global sport, right? You can do it without needing any money, right? So it's also like a sport where poor people are able to run, and so that means that it doesn't matter who you are or where you're from, you're able to like compete and do well and what have you. Of course, this is all nonsense. In fact, generally speaking, the places that put more money into their running programs or where running is valued, and therefore, have a bunch more athletes who are working on this and doing this a lot of the time, do just tend to do better in track events over time, and I think that play, I think, between some of the mythologies of running and some of the actualities of running are a part of what I'm after in this book. I think the other really strange thing about running is just the language, and the language that sprinters have. Like if you get really tired at a race and you run out of speed, people say that you died, It's a really interesting phrase, and like, when they talk about someone speeding up really fast in the last 150 meters, they say like, that person kicked, and it's, if you like have a really strong kick and you can watch kind of in slow motion, you covering the range of someone ahead of you, people say that you like walked them down, and the language in and of itself, I think, gives light, foregrounds some of the slipperiness of running, some of the ways in which there's always a kind of interplay between the stories that people tell about running and the mythologies of what running affords and the actualities of what running is, which is to say a fundamentally really difficult sport that is also not, universally accessible by any means.
Yes, yes. And Daniel creates a space sort of apart for himself on the team. His friends are from all different backgrounds, different races, different identities, and they create this really interesting kind of dynamic. It's like its own small planet with its own rules. And I love that what happens in this book is he goes back to the planet. And part of that planet also is planet Florida. You go deep into Palm Coast and you go deep into Florida. And, as a Floridian myself, I get very tired of defending the honor of Florida and my love for this place, my sometimes irrational love. And I was so happy to read about these sections, these places. My mother, as you know, my mother lives in St. Augustine, so I'm very familiar with Palm Coast and that whole section of northern Florida. And so it was very affirming for me to read those sections. And I feel like I haven't read, it hasn't made a big appearance in much literature. There is some, but not a lot. So I wondered if you could speak to the use of place in your book. Was setting really important for you? Was that a really essential piece?
Oh, setting's everything, Florida is probably the most active and important character in the book. It certainly drives all of the description and the language, down to, the ways that like Daniel and Desmond talk to each other. I love Florida. It's really interesting as a place, and I think, in other places, sometimes people have a desire to imagine that they're somehow separate from Florida in ways that are really strange. I think, maybe the like most obvious example that I encounter is when people talk about, whatever, like X, Y, or Z, quote unquote, racist thing that happened in Florida. And I'm like, yeah, but you live in New York. It's like, it's not like a sort of famous, anti-racist paradise, but I think that there's something there, where people have a really hard time facing up to the realities of the lives of the country that they live in. And so they kind of project them onto Florida, which is indeed much more complicated and much more beautiful and much more interesting than people think. Yeah. And they project them onto Florida as a means of actually not recognizing their own sort of complicity or their own, whatever, turning a blind eye, whatever word you have for that kind of relationship where you're in the middle of this thing that's unfolding and you're pretending that in fact it's 1,000 miles south of you,
That's right.
And it's quite bizarre. I think additionally, I'm with you on, I have been sort of diving deep into some of the like writing about that region and about, Jacksonville and some of the like, local historical societies writing about Flagler County. And there's some writing about Henry Flagler, of course, but not a ton about that region, despite the fact that it's quite populous, and it's, I think also there's a kind of history and dignity that to the lives that people eke out there that I did not feel I was reading in places. And that I think was a big part of what drew me to writing about, Flagler County.
That's so cool. I loved it, and it really, I think what you say is so true that people want to somehow say, oh, the problem is Florida. The problem is not us. And, Oregon is a wonderfully progressive state where they didn't allow any Black people. Problem solved.
Yeah.
And I love Oregon, don't get me wrong, but that doesn't mean that you have somehow solved racism. You haven't confronted it.
Yeah. People do this with the South in general. People talk about like whatever, slavery in southern states, and it's like, sure, but the companies that were insuring people for their enslaved people, which is to say their quote unquote property, those are all in the north. All that money went north,
That's right. And you do get into the fact of economics in these characters' lives as well, how much class plays a role in their identities, and how that, in certain ways, rides alongside of race. So that a character like Aubrey, who is a self-professed cracker, shares a great deal with the characters who are of different races than her own, and actually, in many ways, shares an identity with these characters that transcends anything that has to do with the constructions of race, and the very real exigencies of class and the oppressiveness of poverty. It made me think about, there's an article I read. It was an interview with a Palestinian writer who said that he felt that all Palestinians were imprisoned by Palestine. And what he meant by that just basically is that he felt like you always have to address the occupation. You always have to address this idea of political fighting and struggle for your identity, and that it's exhausting, and that it can feel limiting as an artist. And I wanted to ask you, Elias, do you feel like writers, do we owe readers anything? Do we owe them some kind of, is there a responsibility toward our collective understanding of the truth? Is this something that must be addressed in writing? What would you say to something like that?
That's a good question. I've been thinking recently about, on the one hand, everything that we gain, I think, in literature when we actually address the obligations that we feel. Part of what I felt actually was compelled to write about this region. I was like, I'm tired of people talking about like my people, my friends, and also friends who they've, like wealthier people in other parts of the US had more or less abandoned, had like no real investment in their lives or progress. I was tired of that, I was like, all right, for me, it's like, I want to just like sit in all of this glory that I don't get to do on my day to day because whatever, I'm, living in Philly and I'm working, or I'm elsewhere or what have you, and so to me, I really came out, I think, in the green. I really profited from feeling like I had an obligation and sitting in it,
Mm-hmm.
I think additionally, I have a really hard time when people talk about readers in general. I really appreciate that reading, and I think about like, what it is that I owe to readers, and I'm like, who is that reader? Who are they?
Who are they?
Who are they? I have some friends who I do think I owe some things to, and some family members who I do think I owe some things to. And I work really hard to meet those obligations, and I try to do that as well in my writing. And you end up actually benefiting for it. Today, a friend of mine, texted me that he was listening to the audiobook and then was just like, I'm sorry also for all the fucked up shit that, I did when we were in high school. I was young and insecure. Yeah, and I was like, it's not, that obligation it's a two-way street, and I think we all have something to gain from that. I was like, oh yeah, I didn't write this book to make you feel bad. I was like, I'm sorry for the shit that I did, and
right.
And that's like the most meaningful thing to me,
That's so cool. That is meaningful. And there's that feeling that you've reached people in ways that you hadn't expected to when you start writing the story, that you transcend your own expectations, and that's amazing.
You're very lucky.
Yeah, it is. It's fabulous. And, and I think that's a really interesting way of framing the question, about what writers owe readers of anything. There are some writers, I think, who would say, damn the torpedoes, I'm going to write the story as I will. But I do think it seems, from my very limited perspective, that writers who occupy a certain kind of cultural or racial space, they become de facto spokespeople, whether they want to or not. And your work can be held up as a paradigm. This is the voice of whatever it is, whether, and you can stand there and say, no, this is just one story. This is just one story. And then it devolves into that wonderful talk about the one story. There's just the one story or just the one interpretation that then becomes the one that stands in for everything. And I don't know if there's any way of responding to this, but I wondered if you would like to speak to that at all. Do you feel any kind of pressure on yourself to be a spokesperson?
Huh.
Or maybe not yet, but you will.
I was going to say that feels really funny because I still feel kind of like a kid. Like a kid who like skins their knees sometimes.
Yeah. It's coming. It's coming, Elias.
It's like, oh God, if you think I'm the spokesperson, like we are all doomed, you know? It's like, no, but yeah, on a more serious note, what I think is that I try not to worry too much about those things. You know, I try to write things that I think are true or things that I think are important. I try to write things that I think, you know, that I would like my mom to be able to read, you know, things that are not inaccessible, you know, or things, you know, for my friends, you know, to be able to read. And those things end up being really important to me. And it's easy, I think, to feel oneself sort of swept up along the way into feeling like one has to be a spokesperson for all, you know, I mean, you know, in my case, it would be like, what would it mean to be a spokesperson for like what, all Black people in the world? You know, this is a really large population, you know? And yeah, you know, I think it's really easy to feel swept up in that, but I think actually the most important work that tends to be done locally, you know? And I think really deeply about this Robin Kelly line, which is, you know, act local, think global, you know? And I think that's what I think about that, you know, that I'm sort of like, you actually want to focus on the things that are around you and making change here and now. And you want to know the world context, of course, but you want to focus on this here and now. And if along the way people pick you up and start reading you as emblematic of all whatever people, you know, that's kind of on them, you know, because for me, my favorite books feel like I'm overhearing a conversation for someone else, you know?
Yeah. Perfect. That's exactly how I want it to be. You know, you tell your story and hopefully it's heard.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it can't be too direct. It's gotta be somewhat opaque. It's gotta be overheard. I think that's, I love that. I love how you put that. And speaking of that kind of relevance and immediacy, we're coming out of this wild and crazy last year and change. And I wondered if you could talk about, has the pandemic affected your writing life at all? Did it have an impact on you as a writer?
It did in a lot of ways that are all quite boring. You know, I developed like back and neck problems because I was like at my computer all the time. I mean, these are things that are really meaningful to me. You know, now I'm like, I got to stretch my back all the time, you know, and but that I think is important in a way, because I do think that the work of writing, and for some people, this is like their only income. So it's actually quite important, you know, what it means to actually have work conditions where on the one hand, you're like paying for all of the things that you need for work, you know, your computer, whatever, your internet, you know. I used to go into, you know, an English department where they would pay for air conditioning and heat, which I really appreciated because I never wanted to pay for those things. And suddenly I was responsible for a much bigger energy bill. And so there are all these things about the working conditions that I think are really meaningful and are really difficult. I mean, I think also there's a lot that I'm still trying to process. My sentences have just gotten longer and more anxious. I don't really know what it is, but they've gotten longer, and there is a just sort of nervous energy about them, And then in other ways, I've really embraced the sort of small kinds of writing and small kinds of reading. I mean, I think re-engaging with friends via text, sending people notes or like dropping people notes off at their door, particularly at times when we felt like we couldn't really go see each other or whatever, that stuff I think has all been to my benefit. And I think if there's a thing that I really am hopeful for about coming out of this time, I think it's sort of that, kind of for the only time in my adult life, I had a sense that everybody around, or not everybody, but like a lot of people around me were invested in each other's well-being and were acting in these ways that we're trying to preserve each other's well-being, be it, I'm going to slide a note under your door instead of like, running up on you, or like, crossing to the other side of the street, what have you. And I'm sort of hopeful that that kind of sense of responsibility to other people's well-being kind of continues to run through my writing, despite everything I just said.
Yeah.
That is one of the like more meaningful experiences that I've had as a person. I mean, I don't think I really know how that will impact my writing, but I do think that there's something to be said about that interdependence and collective love, for lack of a better word.
Right. Yeah. And it's so interesting that as writers, writers are so impacted by their situation, that we don't go to offices. I mean, we go to maybe a home office or an office at school, but yeah, it's not the big commute. It's not the way so much of the world is set up. So there's this immediacy to that place where we're working, and it feeds directly into the work, I think. I mean, it's so interesting that you feel like your sentences are changing, that you said they're longer and there's sort of anxiety there. I can totally see that. When I was reading your novel, I felt like I was seeing some James Joyce in there. Was that just projection?
No, that sounds accurate. I wonder if there was a particular Joyce line that even made it into the book. I'm not sure. At times there were, like all like nerdy people, every once in a while I was like, what if I just actually wrote in a Joyce line and worked it into my own writing?
Yeah.
There's definitely some Joyce in there. I mean, I think it's it's definitely a kind of like Odyssey story as routed through Joyce, but also, Walcott. I don't know. It's funny, I mean, I think that the things that I like about Joyce are the things that like no one else likes about Joyce. I really love the sort of like anti-colonial sections where they're like, how do we turn Ireland into a nation? We're tired of being a colony, and
yes.
And that stuff, that energy, that I really love that in those books. And I think that I'm hopeful is the thing that makes it through, and not, well, I don't know. I guess it's all good, but there are other things that would be more embarrassingly nerdy than that,
No, I mean, well, it was really exciting to me to sort of discern some of the Ulysses, like, arc of the story, and I was wondering if, I mean, definitely it's an Odyssean kind of a narrative, the return or the attempt to return home. But I was describing your book to a friend, and she said, "Oh, so is it like Junot Diaz?" And I said, I can see that there are going to be comparisons made, but I felt like, at least structurally, that the narrative is doing something that's kind of epic, and that the protagonist he has this larger range and this idea of trying to find home that, post-colonial, I think, is a really powerful way of putting it. It always struck me that Joyce was so much about speaking out of a colonized perspective, that that's what you do when you feel like you're not safe. You have to censor yourself, or you have to hide yourself. You use allusions and riddles and complicated language, and you're using the narrative or the language of the colonizer because you have no choice. You know, that's what you were taught, or that's what you were given. And I saw your characters in some ways doing that. You know, that they were taking the language and then making it their own. And I just wanted to say I really appreciated and enjoyed that, and I want to applaud that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, you know, the Odyssey is just so big for Caribbean writers, and it's like really the Odyssey and the Tempest of the works of Western canon, you know. And the Odyssey, not least because, you know, we all live in islands, you know, and it's right. Like, you know, and that seafaring stuff is really important. And I think that's, you know, that's right. I mean, I think that there's at one point in the book, I basically, well, on the one hand, you know, there are like all sorts of like Odyssean things that I just didn't expect to happen, you know, when I was like, oh, I guess there's a Telemachus. I guess there's like, you know, a moment where like I'm giving everyone their like epic names, you know, and some of that was not on purpose, you know, it's kind of inescapable, and then you have to like work with it in a way. I think also, you know, yeah, there's something to be said about characters who speak in a way that is different than the words that they write, you know, and I had to make a choice at one point, which was, well, do I write down the words as they sound to them, or do I write down the words that they would hear, you know? And that, I think, was a big part of that kind of broader kind of relationship between, yeah, the sort of language that you're given and the text that you're given as a canon versus working through where you are in the world and how you sort of navigate that tension. I mean, I think ultimately I was sort of like, I think I have to write the words as they would write them, because ultimately you would be reading them, you know? But yeah, the Odyssey, it looms large, you know, it looms really large.
I can totally see it. And I so appreciate the way that you're able to address that. You know, I don't know if double consciousness is the right term for this, but there's definitely a doubling or a duality or a blurring that's happening, at the very least for Daniel, if not for several other of the characters as well. Because he goes out and he lives the dream, you know, that they all talk about getting out. And the fascinating thing then is at the end where he's saying, I want to come back, you know. And I was so happy that he wanted to come back. I was like, yes, Daniel, come back. Come back. There's something so satisfying about that. That's not a question. That's just me being a fangirl. But I think I do see you have a question here. Let's open it up and see. Someone's asking, who is your favorite side character in the book and why? Any thoughts on that?
That's a good question. I like that question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, you know, I think actually it's probably Egypt, who doesn't appear till somewhat late. Egypt is Desmond's girlfriend, Daniel's like best friend's girlfriend, and also Daniel's good friend from high school, with whom Daniel sort of fallen out of touch as with everybody else. Yeah, Egypt, I think, what I like about Egypt is that she just does not take their bullshit, you know, in that moment, which I think is really meaningful for Daniel, where Daniel's like, I want to come home, which is really important. You know, it's like a moment where Daniel is effectively learning to love his family, his history, his home, his, you know, his friends. Egypt's like, yeah, I don't know. That sounds like nonsense, you know? And I think that kind of perspective that she brings, which maybe I won't like spoil anything.
Careful.
Yeah. What I'll say is the perspective that she brings and the voice that she brings, I think, is much needed, you know. on the one hand, you have like all these like boys who are basically acting like they're in high school again and like lying a lot and talking a lot of shit and boasting and cracking on each other. And she's like, "This is nonsense. Y'all are too old for this. What's happening here?" You know?
Right.
And on the other hand, like, you know, she has like a whole life that is actually really interesting to me, you know, and that hopefully I will have the opportunity to have that voice return to me and be able to write more of, because her life is really interesting, I think, and shows a different side of Flagler County.
I second that. I love the women characters in this book. They were really satisfying. I love the scene with Jess when she's cooking. There's a great scene in the book that involves pork chops, and it's just really an important scene. So no spoilers. Let's see. There's another question. What do you wish you would have known when you started writing your novel?
You know, my friend, who's a brilliant novelist, Mark Anthony Richardson, and he wrote this book, Year of the Rat, which is very good but underread. He said this thing to me at one point when I was having a really hard time editing, where he was like, well, you know, like, whatever emotions made the book, those emotions don't have to be you, you know, and that was really, really helpful for me, because I was at a moment, you know, where as a person, I had come to feel like I had moved out of the grieving phase. I had felt gratitude towards the friend of mine who had passed. And then I would sit down and write this book that would throw me back into that emotion, you know, because I'd started it then. And it was really hard for me to sort of like walk about my day and sort of be pulled back to this emotion that I'm like, this doesn't even actually feel accurate for how I'm making sense of things right now. As well as it was just sad. You know, I just felt sad thinking and sitting in that despair again, you know, and that advice I thought was really, really important to me. You know, I think it's helpful to feel an emotion deeply, whatever emotion it is that you feel, sadness, anger, happiness, whatever, as you're writing. I think for me, emotions drive writing and tone. But you do need to know that there's a separation, you know, and that you don't necessarily want to bring that with you into the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's a great response. I think, and it's really true. We don't have to become the book. We don't have to stay in the book. Someone is asking, question for both of you, book recommendations. It's always a hard one. Oh boy. Oh gosh. That's a tough one. I really recommend All the Water I've Seen Is Running.
Thank you.
That's my top book recommendation for now.
I did just read Life Without a Recipe, which is It's really good. It is actually really good.
We didn't plan that.
No.
Yeah. What are you reading now?
Yeah, there's this book that's coming out in August by Anthony Viasnaso, After Parties. It's a collection of stories. Anthony actually passed away recently, so he actually won't get to see his book publication. And that book is really incredible. It's about, it's basically about Sacramento, Stockton. My California like geography knowledge is like very unclear, you know, and largely about like second generation Cambodians in that area who were sort of, you know, living their own lives on the one hand, also aware that there is some sort of disconnect between them and their parents who, you know, fled Cambodia often because of the genocide and the war, and then their parents' parents who lived through that as adults. And that book is really amazing. I'm also reading the poems of Asiya Wadood. Those are very good. I really like those. She wrote this book, Syncope, that just came out, which I don't really know how to describe it, but she does things with words and images that I would like never think of, and so it often feels like a discovery.
Writing that down. Okay. Wonderful. I'm not familiar with either of those writers. Let's see. I just read A Woman Is No Man by Etaf Rum. And that's a really powerful narrative. It's a really risky book. She talks about domestic abuse and the Arab American immigrant communities. And it's really risky, because she's talking about a culture under siege that is, relentlessly negatively portrayed in American media, and she's going into some really dark truths. But it's gripping, and I'm just so impressed with her bravery for doing it. So
yeah, a book that takes risks. That's kind of everything.
That's right. Yeah. Let's see, and I see another question has come up here. Was there some connection between Daniel's running and Dez's quote, "All the water I've seen is running"?
Probably. The good news, the best thing about a book being out is that I'm no longer the only person responsible for what the book means.
Yeah.
Which, I say that like jokingly, but also seriously, like what's really nice and relieving about this period of time is that, for so long you feel like you're the shepherd of the book's meaning, and now like readers get to decide. So, you get to decide, whoever you are that asked this question, if you have some thoughts about this. But for me, I think, what Des is saying is effectively, there's a whole, lot of the world that he hasn't seen, and this is his world, and for both of them, running was also that world, that was their sort of everything, and it sort of became a part of their everything. And I think that to me is maybe one connection, though maybe you have a better read, but that's maybe one connection between that running and the water running.
Yeah, it's such a cool title, and it's not an easy title. It's very evocative. Okay, I see the hook is coming out.
Well, I think that's a really great place to finish, and I love when readers can connect to a text, and I can always see when it like lights up an author's eyes, because it adds new meaning and it creates a richer, better life for the story. But thank you so much, Elias. Thank you so much, Diana. This was such a fantastic talk, and I'm sure the audience agrees. I just want to remind everyone in the audience, if you haven't read Elias's book yet, you can order it from us. We would appreciate it if you ordered it from us. And you can do so by clicking the green button below. And I also want to remind you guys that this talk was recorded. So if you know someone who missed it, you can share the same link that you used to arrive here with them, and they can watch it on their own time. So again, thank you, Diana. Thank you, Elias.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Yeah, really, that was fun. Great questions.
Yeah, good questions.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you at our next virtual event.
Have a good night.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.